the Russian narrative surrounding NATO's expansion is rooted in an alleged verbal commitment made in the early 1990s. During negotiations over Germany's reunification, then U.S. Secretary of State James Baker reportedly stated that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. While this promise was never formalized in official documents, it is often cited by the Kremlin as the foundation for accusing the West of breaking agreements and threatening Russia's security. This idea gained traction among Russia's political elites and society, becoming a central element of Moscow's official rhetoric. For the Kremlin, NATO's expansion represents a direct threat to its sphere of influence. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, many former Warsaw Pact countries and Soviet republics sought integration with the West, viewing NATO as a safeguard against potential Russian pressure. However, Moscow interpreted this movement as a hostile act, fueling the perception that Russia was being strategically encircled. This interpretation is used internally to justify aggressive defense policies and reinforce the narrative of a Russia in a perpetual state of siege. From this perspective, NATO is seen as the main driver of regional instability. Russia argues that by expanding its borders eastward, the alliance has created strategic imbalances, making a military response inevitable. The Kremlin has leveraged this narrative to justify actions such as the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. According to Moscow, these measures are necessary responses to the perceived threat posed by an increasingly Western presence near its borders. While this narrative has been widely disseminated, it is contested by Western governments and experts. They argue that NATO's expansion was a response to the demands of Eastern European countries, not an initiative to isolate or confront Russia. However, for Moscow, maintaining this narrative is crucial for mobilizing domestic support and projecting the image of a resilient Russia standing firm against Western interference. The Russian narrative about NATO's expansion, though challenged by numerous nations and analysts, remains a cornerstone of the Kremlin's discourse. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO's growth was seen by Moscow as a direct threat to its security. The first major step in this process came in 1999 with the admission of Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. For these countries, joining NATO was a way to ensure their security against potential Russian revanchism. But for the Kremlin, it represented an attempt by the West to restrict its sphere of influence. In 2004, this dynamic intensified with the addition of 7 new members, including the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These nations, historically subjected to Russian domination, saw NATO as an opportunity to secure their independence and stability. However, for Moscow, the alliance's presence on its borders dealt a significant blow to its strategic status. This sentiment was amplified by the fact that NATO's expansion not only solidified new allies in Eastern Europe, but also shifted the regional balance of power. The West defended NATO's expansion as a legitimate and voluntary initiative by its new members, who sought protection and modernization. Moreover, supporters of the process argued that NATO was never intended to encircle or confront Russia. Nevertheless, Moscow continued to present this narrative of an external threat as justification for its own geopolitical and military moves, fostering mutual distrust between the parties involved. As NATO pushed further into Eastern Europe, tensions with Russia escalated. At the height of this process in 2008, the alliance announced that Georgia and Ukraine could become members in the future, a move Moscow viewed as a direct provocation. This decision crossed one of the Kremlin's so-called red lines, marking a turning point in Russia-West relations. For the Kremlin, the potential loss of influence over these two strategically critical countries represented an existential threat to its geopolitical position. Georgia, located in the Caucasus, holds strategic importance both in terms of security and energy infrastructure, as the region serves as a corridor for major gas pipelines. Ukraine, on the other hand, carries even greater geopolitical weight. Historically, Ukrainian territory has been central to Russia's security, acting as a buffer zone between Moscow and the West. If these countries joined NATO, It would further shift the balance of power in the region, with Ukraine, in particular, becoming a critical focal point for Russian foreign policy. To justify its actions, Russia adopted a confrontational stance toward countries aspiring to join NATO. The 2008 invasion of Georgia marked a turning point, as Moscow demonstrated its willingness to use military force to preserve its influence in the region. In Ukraine's case, this posture escalated dramatically with the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and, later, the full-scale invasion in 2022. Moscow defended these actions as protective measures against Western encroachment, reinforcing its narrative that NATO was deliberately ignoring Russia's security concerns. Despite this, international analysts point out that the Kremlin's stance is not solely about security concerns, but also reflects its ambition to reassert itself as a global power. The concept of red lines is used in this context both as a deterrent and as a justification for military interventions. The controversy over NATO's expansion cannot be separated from the historical context of Germany's reunification in 1990. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the impending end of the Cold War, Western and Soviet leaders intensely negotiated Europe's future. One of the central questions was the role of a reunified Germany in the new political order. Moscow wanted Germany to adopt neutrality, fearing that its continued membership in NATO would strengthen Western influence in the region. However, Western leaders, such as German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, argued that remaining in NATO was essential to ensuring European stability. During these negotiations, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker reportedly stated that NATO would move not 1 inch eastward. However, this statement was never formalized in official documents. The lack of a written commitment left room for conflicting interpretations. For Moscow, it was an implicit understanding that the West later violated. For the United States and its allies, it was a contextual statement about Germany, with no implications for future NATO members. This divergence sowed the seeds of mistrust between the two sides. The decision to keep a unified Germany in NATO marked a turning point in reshaping Europe's balance of power. For the West, it symbolized the triumph of democracy and the consolidation of a free and integrated Europe. For Moscow, however, NATO's growing influence, even if initially limited to Germany, signaled that Soviet interests were being sidelined in the new geopolitical order. This sentiment was compounded by the economic and political crises Russia faced in the 1990s, leaving it with no effective means to challenge these changes. Germany's reunification was only the first step in a broader restructuring of European security. Despite assurances of cooperation between Moscow and the West, the collapse of the Soviet Union and NATO's subsequent expansion exposed underlying tensions that would persist for decades. The history of these negotiations continues to be leveraged by the Kremlin to justify its narrative of Western betrayal, while the West views them as a reflection of the sovereign aspirations of countries seeking NATO's protection. This narrative conflict remains at the heart of current disputes. The accession of Central and Eastern European countries to NATO was driven by a strong desire to secure sovereignty and safety, especially after decades under Soviet domination. During the Cold War, these nations were part of the Warsaw Pact, a Moscow-led military alliance that reinforced its influence in the region. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, these countries saw a historic opportunity to break with the past and integrate with the West, seeking protection against any potential resurgence of Russian hegemony. Beyond security concerns, joining NATO also symbolized a step toward political and military modernization. Many of these countries faced challenging transitions to democracy and viewed integration with the West as a path to strengthening their institutions. Membership in the alliance required significant internal reforms, including the modernization of their armed forces and a commitment to democratic principles. For these nations, NATO was not just a military pact but also a symbol of belonging to the Western community. However, the motivations of these countries are not always fully acknowledged in the Russian narrative. Moscow often portrays NATO's expansion as a Western imposition, ignoring the fact that the decision to join the alliance was voluntary and supported by local populations. Public opinion surveys at the time showed widespread support for NATO membership in countries such as Poland, Estonia, and the Czech Republic, reflecting deep distrust of Russia and a strong desire to avoid any return to past instability. The quest for NATO's protection also reflects a geopolitical concern shared by many of these nations: uncertainty about Russia's future. Even weakened in the 1990s, Russia was still seen as an unpredictable actor capable of projecting power in its neighborhood. Joining NATO was therefore a long-term strategic choice, transcending military alliances to ensure a stable future aligned with Western values. While Russia insists that NATO's expansion was the result of Western betrayal, many governments contest this view, arguing that the Russian narrative oversimplifies and distorts historical facts. NATO's growth was not an imposition but the result of sovereign decisions by Eastern European countries seeking protection after decades of Soviet domination. These governments saw the alliance as an opportunity to align with democratic values and secure themselves against a Russia that, even weakened in the 1990s, was still perceived as a potential threat. The notion that the West tricked Russia by expanding NATO overlooks the complexity of negotiations in the early 1990s. The alleged promises that NATO would not move eastward were never formalized in treaties. Furthermore, Russia itself signed the NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997, committing to cooperation and recognizing the sovereign right of countries to choose their alliances. Moscow's initial stance of collaboration, however, gradually shifted to a more confrontational narrative as Vladimir Putin consolidated power. The Western betrayal narrative also serves a strategic domestic purpose. By blaming NATO for regional insecurity, the Kremlin deflects attention from the aggressive policies it has pursued over the years. The annexation of Crimea in 2014, for instance, was justified as a response to a Western threat, when it was, in fact, an effort to reassert control over areas of strategic interest. The same logic applied to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, framed as a preventive defense against NATO but widely interpreted by Western governments as part of a broader strategy to rebuild Russian influence. Ultimately, this narrative battle is a struggle for legitimacy. While Russia positions itself as the victim of an expansionist West, Eastern European governments argue that their choices were driven by a desire for sovereignty and freedom. For NATO and its members, the Russian narrative is a tool of disinformation, used to justify military actions and pressure adversaries. This clash of perspectives highlights the complexity of international politics and illustrates how narratives can be as powerful as military forces in the geopolitical arena. Located at the crossroads between Eastern Europe and Russia, Ukraine has always been seen as a critical buffer zone for Russian security. For Moscow, maintaining influence over Ukrainian territory is essential to preventing the West from gaining direct access to its borders. On the other hand, for NATO and the European Union, Ukraine represents an opportunity to consolidate a system of alliances based on democratic values and economic integration. One of the factors that heightens Ukraine's geopolitical relevance is its access to the Black Sea, a critical commercial and strategic route. The Black Sea connects to the Mediterranean via the Bosporus Strait, controlled by Turkey, and this maritime pathway is crucial for both trade and military movements. Control of Ukraine's coastline, including Crimea, gives Russia a strategic advantage, ensuring its presence in southern Europe and its ability to project power into the Mediterranean. This maritime connection, albeit indirect, is one of the reasons Moscow considers it vital to prevent Ukraine from fully falling into the Western sphere of influence. In addition to its strategic location, Ukraine boasts significant natural resources and infrastructure that are of interest to both Russia and the West. The country is one of the world's largest grain exporters and has an extensive network of pipelines connecting Russian natural gas fields to European markets. These factors make Ukraine not only a security concern but also an essential economic asset. Any shift in Ukraine's geopolitical alignment could have profound implications for the regional balance of power. For Russia, the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO is seen as a major geopolitical defeat. Such a move would shift the strategic balance in Europe, diminishing Moscow's ability to project power in its immediate neighborhood. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 and support for separatist movements in eastern Ukraine reflect the Kremlin's efforts to ensure the country remains within its sphere of influence. Russia justifies these actions as defensive measures, though Western governments widely view them as acts of aggression intended to block Ukraine's integration with the West. In recent history, NATO's expansion and tensions between Russia and the West have been shaped by a complex web of narratives, sovereign decisions, and strategic disputes. The notion that NATO poses a threat to Russia's security is central to the Kremlin's rhetoric. However, an analysis of the facts reveals that Eastern European countries' decisions reflect a legitimate desire for security and stability, rather than a Western conspiracy. This clash of narratives has become a cornerstone of contemporary geopolitics. Events beginning with Germany's reunification and the informal promises made in the 1990s paved the way for the divisions we see today. Russia's narrative of Western betrayal has become an effective tool to justify military interventions and apply pressure on adversaries. However, Western governments argue that NATO's expansion was a response to the legitimate demands of Eastern European countries seeking protection and integration after decades under Soviet influence. This divergence in perspectives has profoundly shaped Europe's security landscape. Ukraine has emerged as the primary battleground in this conflict, both literally and symbolically. Its strategic position, resources, and role as a bridge between Russia and the West make it a focal point of tensions that transcend national borders. The 2022 Russian invasion demonstrates the lengths Moscow is willing to go to maintain its influence, while the Western response reflects a growing resolve to uphold the principles of sovereignty and self-determination. This confrontation continues to shape the geopolitical dynamics of the 21st century. Understanding the historical and geopolitical reasons behind these conflicts is essential to uncovering the motivations of each side. NATO's expansion, far from being a unilateral act or a premeditated threat, was the result of sovereign and legitimate choices made by the countries involved. Conversely, Russia's insistence on portraying itself as a victim of Western betrayal serves more as a mechanism for internal consolidation and power projection. And if you enjoyed this content, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. Stay tuned for the next video, which is already on your screen.